Today we're hearing about Battle Creek's first school teacher, Warren Shepard, presented by WMU professor Michael Nassaney.
Great. All right. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and I appreciate the museum being able to reschedule this event from January. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So it's been a while since I've been involved in this project, but my work in Battle Creek is still very, very important to me because it's some of the first local archaeology that I did when I came to Southwest Michigan, to Western Michigan University. So I want to talk to you today about archaeological discoveries at the Warren Shepard site. And in talking with some of you already before the presentation, I think I'm going to probably learn as much from you as you're going to be able to learn from me. So I'll look forward to that. So here are some of my talking points for today. So I'll tell you a little bit about my interest in Warren Shepard and how I got started in this project and how I got connected up with the Historical Society of Battle Creek at the time. I'll tell you a little bit about what I know about who Warren Shepard was and how we know about him. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what the documents and the archaeology have revealed about Warren Shepard. Well, first off, this was one of the projects that I became attracted to when local people people from the Historical Society of Battle Creek called me, and they said, well, you're an archaeologist. We've recently acquired this house, this brick Greek Revival house. We have some plans for it, and we'd like to increase the visibility of our activity there and learn a little bit more about the person who lived there, and we think that archaeology could assist with that. So at the time I was looking to establish a local project, a place for my archaeological field school to conduct investigations. And this was around circa 1994, 95 is when they contacted me. And a site like this would fall into the realm of what we refer to as historical archaeology. So in other words, it's the archaeology of a site that was occupied by people from the relatively recent past, people who left written documents, so we can learn about them and their history, not only from the artifacts and the foundations and the other materials we can recover from the ground, but also from documentary sources, maps, and various other types of written records. And so it seemed like it would be an interesting project, and before we did any work, we wanted to learn a little bit more about what the documents could tell us, right? So ideally, historical archaeologists want to consult the archives and the library before they actually dig anything in the ground, before they actually break the ground surface, to sort of learn as much as they can before they actually do any excavations. And so it was a couple of my students that really started the background research, and I'll talk about them when I talk about some of the documents they consulted. And it was that work that suggested, there could be some interesting issues that could be explored here, and this could be a worthwhile project. So we ended up spending kind of fast forwarding a little bit, the summer of 1996. We also acquired funding from the Miller Foundation at the time to extend that field season for another 4 or 5 weeks. So we're in the field for about 10 weeks that summer. And then we came back again in 1998 and did another field season there. We eventually transitioned into doing some work at the Seventh-day Adventist Village as well. And the reason we did that was we were interested in understanding these places, these 19th century landscapes, from the perspective of what I would call a social archaeology. So in other words, we wanted to understand about the social relations of the people. So we wanted to understand about their social class. We wanted to understand about gender relations. What activities were men involved in? What activities were women involved in? Shepard, as it turns out, was upwardly mobile, right? A hard worker, a farmer, came to acquire more land, also had a little bit of, maybe you might say luck, good luck, bad luck. I'll tell you more about it. So trying to understand his place in the community and then the way he expressed his social status, one of the ways through this very fine and handsome brick Greek Revival house, right? So this would not have been common in the day when it was constructed, and I'll show you some of the other features of it that would have distinguished it. So he's using the house, he's using the interior, he's using the ceramics that he acquired as a way to communicate a message about his social status to other members of the community. This is the kind of information that the archaeology can get and can complement what we learn from the written documents. So the other reason, why did I become interested in Warren Shepard? Well, you know, sometimes you say archaeologists do like sort of autobiography in a sense. The topics they're interested in are topics that sort of reflect their own identity in some ways. So I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. I'd made my way to Western Michigan University in 1992. It was a major uprooting, brought my family here and so on. Warren Shepard moved from Western New York, and he moved to Battle Creek thanks to the Erie Canal, right, which was constructed in about 1825, but this really opened the floodgate, so to speak, in terms of population and in terms of migrants coming mostly from Western New York, from other places too, but lots from Western New York coming into Michigan. Warren Shepard was a school teacher. Well, I was, you know, invited to come to Western Michigan University to instruct students like Emily Powell and Cameron Youngs and others and so on. So I had that connection to him as well. And then he was upwardly mobile, right? So that's a young, struggling person, and here it is, I came in as an assistant professor with my meager salary and sort of worked my way into the middle class and so on, maybe. So there are some interesting parallels, I think, and that's often what happens is archaeologists become interested in topics because they sometimes see themselves in the subjects that they study. So again, why did they select me? Well, again, there's some happenstance that just takes place here. I don't even remember who first contacted me. I know some of the players that were involved, and I'll talk about them early on. You know, it's not unusual for people to call Western Michigan University and ask, hey, do you have expertise on this? And can you help us out with that? And so anyway, the call came in and the timing was right, and came over, looked at the house, and you know, we sort of decided, we then did, as I said, more background research, and so it was a slow process, but once it got rolling, it was an interesting research project. And again, it fit with my goals as a historical archaeologist. So I had just finished some work in New England looking at 18th century landscapes. So in other words, how did people, what was the appearance of their houses, and where did they place barns and fences and lawns, and how do they sort of present themselves to the public? So this is something that I was interested in from an 18th century context, and here I thought I could explore it in this 19th century context. In fact, it became part of what we came to be known as the Southwest Michigan Historic Landscape Project. And we investigated sites in Plainwell, the 2 sites in Battle Creek, and then also a site in Jackson, Ella Sharp's site, and so on. And so my students worked on those sites with me, and that became the database where we were able to do some interesting comparative work, where we would compare the places to see how they were similar and how they were different in the 19th and into the 20th century. So again, that's basically my interest in what we call landscapes. And I mentioned my interest in social relations and social identities, and then just in American history, trying to understand a little bit more about American history. And, you know, some historians would say, and I don't really believe this, but some historians would say that since these people were literate, I mean, pretty much everything we want to know has been written down. We have census records and agricultural censuses and letters and diaries and ledgers and so on, maps, and surely there can't be anything else that could be learned from these places. Well, on the contrary, right? Because the very mundane objects that people used in daily life that they discarded are very much expressive of who they are as people. Right? You can picture if somebody went into your house, right, with your permission, of course, and just kind of looked around, and they looked to see, you know, what are your collectibles, and, you know, what does your china look like, and what's the furniture, what's your style, and this and that. They can obtain lots of information from you, and you know that, right? You know that. So when people make these consumer choices, when they choose the material objects that they want to surround themselves with, they're very much expressive of who they are as people, as men, as women, as people of varying social classes, maybe their ethnicity, and so forth. And so this is what we wanted to explore here. And the archaeology can contribute to this, because I assure you that not everything that we know about, that we want to know about people, has been written down, right? Because so much of it is so mundane. You know, things like what people ate, for example, right? Very mundane, and this stuff we don't necessarily write that in our diaries or record it at all. So archaeologists always begin with a research problem or a research design. So in other words, it's not just about digging to find stuff. Right, they approach archaeological sites with research questions, right? And the research questions that we had to do with the landscape, and how is the landscape expressive of who Warren Shepard, and then his descendants, as well as people who lived in the property after him. I mean, eventually it passed out of his family, and there were other people who lived there. We wanted to know, well, how did they make changes, and what did they keep the same, and so on, and how did they express who they were as well? And there's a very interesting history, and I'll talk more about that, of course. So our local informants, right? Maybe we should say consultants. Informant sounds insidious, I think, but were of course Mary Butler and Randy Case. So Mary was very instrumental at the outset of the program, of the project here, and worked very closely with my students in pointing them to the archives and pointing them to an important document that I'll mention in a minute as well. And Randy, of course, is a local architectural historian, among other things. And it was Randy who sort of took me around and showed me some of the features of the house that, you know, I just wasn't that familiar with, and so on. And so that was very important also. Of course, Mary was with the Historical Society, and I say was because I haven't been connected, right, to the organization for a long time now, although I served on the board of the Historical Society for about 5 or 6 years. I was very active in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And I do see Randy from time to time, and again, he was also on the board. So they were sort of my lifeline, and the people that I consulted with and got connected with when we were doing this work, particularly in the beginning. And then there were other people who also contributed in various ways. But it was two of my students, Dan Sayers and Jason Lapham, who did the original exploratory work. And I was just going through some documents, all of which will be brought here to the museum along with the artifacts. So these are not only notes and field records and so on that we created in the course of doing the work, but also in doing our background research, we came upon various articles and so on for background information that I think would be of interest to someone who's going to do further work. And since this chapter is sort of over for me, I mean, we were happy to donate all that material here to the museum. But Jason and Dan Sayers were doing independent study, and we stumbled upon their independent study report. It's about a 75-page report for their independent study. So, I mean, they got into it, and they were coming over to Battle Creek all the time, and they found some interesting material that, that really got me then charged up and interested in the project. So knowing a little bit more about Warren Shepard, of course, was really important. And so much of the very specific biographical details I probably won't be able to recall completely. And I know some of you know about him. But, I mean, I already told you that he came from New York State. And, of course, came in the 1830s. And, of course, I mean, Battle Creek had just been established at that point. The area had just been platted. Not much earlier, maybe late 1820s, early 1830s. And he came in the 1830s, lived in a log cabin somewhere on his, I think at the time it might have been about 80 acres, if I'm not mistaken. He eventually acquired more land, and he ended up with about 120 acres, I think is what it was. But he lived in a log cabin. And interacted with Native Americans at the time, and he did obviously he did teach students. I'm trying to remember, I think he went to their houses, if I'm not mistaken, at the time. There was no schoolhouse or anything like that. And he only did that, though, for a short period of time. And he soon went into brick making. We were discussing that earlier. I don't recall how long he was involved in that, but he soon began to cultivate the land that he was on, right? And he became a fairly successful farmer, I would say. He had hired, he had a wife whose name now is escaping me, and 2 daughters as well. And there were some hired hands also. So it was a large enough operation where he needed to hire some people. They were raising livestock. There were sheep, and of course chickens. There are probably some horses on the farm as well. Maybe some other some animals. I think there were some cows as well. Again, and the agricultural census can give us the specific numbers on this. There was a small garden that was maintained. He had orchards, pear and apple orchards, I seem to recall. And of course, he was growing other crops as well. So it was mixed farming, and he was slowly clearing the land and extending his agricultural fields as he went over the course of the 1840s, 1850s, until 1876, I think it was, when he passed away. And then the house came into the hands of his daughters. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. That's some of what we know about Warren Shepard. And here he is. Right, so his moniker, his nickname, he'll always be known as Battle Creek's first school teacher. But we found it somewhat ironic that he taught for such a very short time, maybe like a couple of years, according to our records. So what are some of the sources that we consult to get this information? Obviously, you saw an example of a photograph there. That doesn't give us a lot of information about him. We could probably get a sense of how old he was when that photo was taken. And we know he was born, I think, around 1800, the early part of the 19th century. He moved probably when he was in his late 20s, his early 30s. And then, as I said, he died in 1876. Maybe he was like in his late 60s or early 70s at the time. But besides that kind of information, we'd want to consult other written documents. And we were quite fortunate insofar as Warren Shepard left a ledger. He left an account book. So it's not for the entirety of the period that he was living and working in Battle Creek, but as I recall, it's a number of decades. And we can't be certain that he recorded everything over that period, but I can give you a sense of the kinds of information that was in there. Some of the information has to do with his agricultural activities. So he talks about some of the quantities, bushels of apples and so on, and so we get some insight into that. We get some quantitative economic information from goods he acquired from a local general store. So the kinds of goods that he was acquiring, or members of his household. In addition, there are some names of maybe hired hands, maybe even individuals who are associated with the Underground Railroad. We can't be certain, but some rather interesting names like Pompey or Pompey is one of the names that shows up. There was also an entry where it shows a number of items associated with notions, right? So sewing and thread and these sorts of things and so on. They're listed, and then there's the amounts. The amounts are listed in another column, and then they are crossed off, right, in an interesting way, as if these things were somehow paid for by him for somebody else. So there's some tantalizing clues as to what was going on in his daily life. People he hired, people who lived on the farmstead, maybe people who were just passing through, and some of the activities that he was involved in. And we've looked at it, we've studied it, but it could be mined for lots more information, right? It's not like we've tapped it out and we know everything there is to know about it, by no means. As historians, as archaeologists come to these records with new questions, they read them in different ways and they can learn new things from them. The other piece that was really intriguing, and Dan, to this day, talks about this. He was, and I'm not trying to remember where this was even held, if it was in the field, in the place where Mary Butler works, in the Fieldstone, is the Fieldstone house, or the Fieldstone?
Well, it's a hospital, but it's
Okay.
in the basement.
Yeah, and what is it called, Fieldstone?
House.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if the record was there or if it was in the local library, but in any event, they stumbled on a court case. So it turns out that sometime in like the late 1840s or so, apparently the Kalamazoo River was dammed in this vicinity, and some of Warren Shepard's land was flooded. So he did what every good American would do. He sued, right? He sued. And he won. Wouldn't you know that immediately thereafter, that brick Greek revival house emerges. Starts its construction in 1852 and is completed in 1854. So we can't help but making that connection between that windfall through the suit. It was maybe $2,000 or something, but I mean, back in the I don't know what today's equivalent was. Maybe it was the equivalent of 150 grand or something. I don't know, right? But
Say more.
perhaps, yeah.
200 grand.
Yeah. So in any event, he begins building the house shortly thereafter, moves from that from that log cabin into this brick Greek revival house. And Dan talks about it, and to this day, he says, as he opened this file, he felt like he was like the first one that was looking at this file, since it was like tucked away like in the 1850s, right? And really discovering something about this man that maybe somebody else knew, but it'd been forgotten, to be certain. So we have access to photographs, right? Unlike the archaeology of like ancient America of hundreds and thousands of years ago, right? In this instance, at least after the 1860s, 1870s, right? We have photography available to us. It was neat too. We did an open house and we had people visit the site, and some people who had lived in the house came by from like they lived there in the 1930s and 40s. And one older woman who, as a child, had like kept a rabbit as a pet and so on. And then they had photographs showing like the little rabbit hutch and this sort of thing, and just what the landscape looked like and so on. So we were fascinated by that because we were finding clues that were related to that, but we couldn't fully interpret them. And so by talking to people, oral accounts, and by looking at their photographs, we're gaining insight into what the archaeology is telling us as well. So they kind of work together, right, to inform each other, these different lines of evidence. Various maps that are available to us. I'll show you some examples, show us where buildings were and where the flooded area was, and then, of course, what I've often referred to as the biggest artifact on the site is, of course, the house itself, right? And studying the house as a huge artifact, right? And what it can tell us about people of the time, particularly Warren Shepard and his family. So some of the written sources I mentioned already is this ledger. And this is what it looks like. And this is what it looks like, right? So it's, fairly legible. Essentially, it's an account book. Again, I can't, in this light, I can't read it that well here, but actually this says coffee, sugar, flour, so, and then that's probably 16 cents. I don't know what the quantity is here, and then here this says 1856. This March 11, 1856. Is today March 11? Mm-hmm. Yes. May 11. All right. Okay. That was close. Here it says cash, potatoes, and so on. So, in any event, there's probably 50, 60 pages maybe of text. And in the back, there's some symbols of, what's that secret society there with this handshake? And
Mason?
Yeah. He was a Mason, and there's some information, some cryptic symbols in the back that, I don't know, somebody smarter than me can probably figure it out. I don't know what it is. So, some of the photographs, I know some of you maybe have seen this before, and I think we dated this photograph by the costume of the woman here, to sometime in maybe the late 20s, early 30s, I think is what we figured. And, this porch is standing. I mean, that porch wasn't there when we got there in 1996, right? So it looked different. I mean, the landscape looked different. This tree wasn't there, right? And so on. So this gives us some information. And the other thing is we know that this is not the original porch. That's like a Victorian addition as well. So we can compare and contrast. How did this building change over the course of its 150-year plus history and so on? What renovations were made and so forth. It's quite fascinating. We spoke to a woman who lived, in the Mitchells, I think it was. I have to check my notes on that. She lived just though it was a neighbor, and she was at the time an octogenarian when we spoke to her, and she was telling us stories from the 1920s and 1930s. And one interesting piece, she said, She said, oh, after the Shepard daughters had left and it was sold to an Italian family, the Miachis, she says they ruined the house. Like they ruined it? What could they have possibly done? So we're talking with her, and she says, oh, they were running a speakeasy. So we're trying to figure this out. She kept saying they ruined the house. And all we can think is that this is maybe things that her father was saying that she kind of remembered, because she was maybe only 8 or 9 years old at the time. Well, I mean, they lived differently than the older Shepard daughters had, right? I mean, turns out they had grown, they had a little vineyard over here. They had grown a couple of rows of grapes. And in between them, they had a little bocce ball court. Right? I mean, they were from Italy. They had this bocce ball court, and they're probably raising grapes to make wine. I mean, this is, right, despite prohibition, right? And so they're probably maybe having a glass of wine on a Sunday afternoon, playing bocce ball, and maybe it can get a little loud and something very different from the very staid, Protestant or more conservative Shepard daughters, I would think. Furthermore, this woman said she'd been in the house, and she said, oh, it was very different then. And of course, the kind of Victorian sensibilities of the Shepard daughters would have been very different than these Italian immigrants and so on. So the little bric-a-brac and the little woven hair things and all this other stuff that they probably was associated with the Shepard daughters was gone. There was the interior furnishings of the house were very different. This porch had probably been removed by then, right? So, I mean, these are the kinds of changes that were taking place and so on, and it's interesting to see how different people also reacted to them and the stories that she had to tell about that. So here's another view. This one's from about 1932. Some of you are probably familiar with the Roberts collection, and so you probably know more about that than I do. And then, we showed up, as I said, in '96, and the house had been purchased. I'm not going to get this precise, but the Historical Society had owned it for a little while, maybe like 5 or 6 years, as I recall. But someone had purchased it in the '80s, and they had some grand design for it as well. But the first thing that they did was they tore off the kitchen extension here. And so we obtained some photographs from this fellow who was doing making these changes. And so this was a valuable archive as well, because we were seeing what he had done and what it looked like before. But the short of it is of course, the kitchenelle or extension was also made out of brick. So the result was there was like bricks everywhere, right? So everywhere we dug at the back of the house, there were bricks. And we saved every single brick. So we're not returning, 45 boxes of bricks to you, luckily. What we've been doing over the last few months, or couple years now, is we've been going through the material. We've recorded what we have. We're saving some of the larger pieces and so on, any pieces that have markings on them, but little tiny fragments and so on, we've weighed and we're going to discard those. And so we'll bring you the material that has research value instead of every last brick that the house was made out of. But that was useful, and you'll see later, I mean, by the time we got there, this was gone, this piece as well. We could just see the outline of the kitchen on the house. And it's being gutted and so on. And
is it burned?
It almost looks that way here, huh? But I don't think so. I think that's just a shadow there. So some of the maps, of course, plat maps from the period. This one's maybe the 1870s, I want to say. And we can see here's the W.B. Shepard property, 118 and some odd acres. And RES, here's his residence. There's a little creek here, and there's a barn here. Of course, that barn has been long gone. And here this says Mineral Spring. So there's a mineral spring on his property. Could have been a place where he could have used this for, let's see, what's that term? Like a little dairy house, right? For keeping things cool and keeping them at a constant temperature, perhaps. It's not unusual for people in the 19th century prior to refrigeration. A spring house, that's the word I'm looking for. And then some of his neighbors here, as you can see, and of course here's the river, and it looks like it encroached on his land up on this corner here.
What is the orientation of that?
Let's see, Riverside is here.
Okay, thank you.
Where's
Yeah.
Territorial?
Let's see, Riverside is here going north-south, I believe. Where would Territorial be? Who can help me out?
I think it's where
East and west.
East and west.
East and west.
It's just a, it's not on your map.
It's up,
Down.
down, okay.
Down in there, yeah.
No,
Okay.
it's not.
No,
No?
Go back late down there. Where it says 160 acres.
Well,
Foster.
this, I'm certain is Riverside.
Right. I think
It's the mill pond there.
it's right at the corner of the property there.
Yeah,
Here?
That's Territorial.
Okay.
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Going here?
House is right there.
Like this? Okay.
Yeah.
It goes all the way to Lake Michigan,
Gotcha.
Territorial. There used to be a bridge there somewhere.
So here's another map. So this was his original parcel, these 79 or so acres. And then he acquired this a little bit later on. And again, here's that little flooded area. Here's his house, and here's the barn. Right. And I guess formerly Coldwater Road? So, okay. So again, maps can be useful to us, and then the architecture itself. So this is a little bit light, but this is architectural drawings of the first and the second floor. And so you can picture today, right? I mean, everybody wants an open concept, right? And of course, in the Victorian era and even before, much more closed spaces. And so we can get a sense. I mean, when you entered his house, of course, you were in sort of a parlor area. And then there was a dining area, and the kitchen, of course, is in the back. And I mean, I know you're all familiar with that. As I recall, it's not unusual to have like a nursery downstairs so that mom could take care of or keep an ear to sick children or whatever. That would have been not uncommon. And of course, the private bedroom spaces all would have been upstairs and so on. So, I mean, it's a fairly modest house by modern standards, but nevertheless, it was well embellished. So shows you some examples here. So this was the molding around the windows. I mean, today, right, you're lucky if you get like, 3 inches, right? And this is probably about this wide, right? So these fluted columns and so on, that was the molding around the windows in the parlor area. So this was very much meant to impress, right, whoever would have come into that public space. Right, and of course the rest of the house would have been more private, and then it would have been more modestly embellished as well. So just a little on the land use history, and I've alluded to this before. I mean, this was just a way for us to kind of make sense out of the changes that took place in the land use practices here. So we refer to the first couple decades as the pioneer period, right, when he was living in his log cabin and just sort of getting established. Then from 1851 to 1876, the time that he died, we would call this the progressive period. Progressive meaning he was very much a progressive farmer, meaning that at this time, the idea that farming could be a science, Farming could be more efficient. Farming could be conducted in ways to ensure greater yields and so on. So there's various rules or guidelines, if you will, that are being promoted, and those more progressive farmers are following these guidelines so that they can essentially become more efficient and more productive and so forth. And so that's the period. There were also cousins, I think, of his or nephews from England, as I recall, because he was English by descent, who were also on the farm at one point. And this is documented in that ledger as well, along with these other hired hands. So there was still an agricultural landscape in the last quarter of the 19th century. This is when Emily and her sister Shepard lived on the property. They were somewhat older at that point. I mean, they weren't doing the farming themselves. One of them was married, one was not. Interesting history that can be sort of pieced together, but there's still agriculture taking place there. But interesting changes that are taking place as well from this agricultural period to the next period, when that large 120-acre almost parcel is then being subdivided. So they're selling off some of that land, and they're no longer doing agriculture, so they're just living in the house, and they're just owning the land in the immediate vicinity of the house. We encountered a feature, and I'll show you a picture of it, that had some animal bones in it from this period, from about the early, let's say the early 20th century, from the 1920s. So this is when these two women, his daughters, are living there. And we also found a trash deposit that was earlier, from about the 60s, 1860s, 1870s, when it was a working farm. And it was really interesting to us because the same kinds of animals were represented. There was turkey, there were some cow bones, pig, some mutton. But what was interesting is that in the early period, the bones were all fairly large. In other words, they were deriving from roasts, like leg of lamb and that sort of thing. In the later period, same species, but the bones were small. They were cut into steaks and chops, right? So the implications there is they're acquiring their food in a very different way, right? Early on, they're butchering their own animals, and they're cooking roasts to feed the hired hands and making big meals. And later on, when Emily Shepard and her sister are living there, they're getting their food probably from the local butcher. And they're just like eating like a little, 4 ounces of meat or whatever. I mean, something small, more than likely. They had no need for like a big roast. So the changes in the demography, the population size of the household, is reflected in the archaeology. And then there was this period when the site was being partly rented. I mean, the Miachis, I think, owned it in the late 20s and into the early 30s. But then there were a series of tenants there till about 1985, and that's when the site was, as best as we can tell, was abandoned. And then that fellow acquired it shortly thereafter and started making some changes. And then he was trying to preserve it, and so was the Historical Society of Battle Creek, and we were doing our part as well. And so we call from 1986 to the present the preservation period, and it continues on. So some of our archaeological approaches. Let's see, you said I had till 6:30? All right, give me about another 20, 25 minutes. We'll get through this, all right? So one of the things we did is a geophysical survey, and I'll show you what that looks like. Basically, we ran some fancy equipment over the ground so we could see beneath the ground to see where there might be places where we'd find interesting archaeological materials. Of course, we then did excavation to see what was beneath the ground, because even though this equipment can give us hints, it can't really tell us exactly what's there. And then we actually did an analysis of the features, the artifacts, and the ecofacts. And ecofacts here, that would be like those animal bones I just talked to you about. So already, that's one of the analyses we did. We looked at, well, what are the bones and what are they derived from, right? And then that told us about these different dietary practices from the 1870s to the 1920s. So here's what a geophysical survey map looks like. This is the house here. This is actually Riverside. And so what's, it's like, okay, it's a pretty picture and lots of nice colors. So basically what we're looking at, this is just differences in magnetic intensity. And so places like here where it's just one color, it's like, there's not much going on there. But places where there's different colors in proximity, there's something there that might be interesting. And some things are linear, like you can see this, it's quite linear. That might be like a metal pipe or something, some kind of utility line, right? So in our excavations here, I don't know, this was one of the local papers, digging into the past. Here's Jason Lapham with one of the other students. So we always got great coverage when we were doing the work locally, and we always welcome people to come to the site as well to see what we were doing. We started by digging small holes, and these are dug on a grid so we know where they are. And then we pass all the soil through a screen like this. We shake it back and forth. Soil passes through, and then rusty nails and other objects we can recover. We keep track of where they come from, and so we have little cards and notations on the provenience or the locations of all the material that we're beginning to return actually today. So here's a neat photo. So here's the back, here's the building, and here's that kitchenelle. And we put this excavation right here, and you can see the foundation continues right there. Right in a line. So as it turns out, right outside the kitchen area is, of course, where Warren Shepard's wife and the other women of the household would have had a kitchen garden. It's also a place where things were just tossed out as well.
So the dishwater out.
Yeah, so a lot of that, and also even broken ceramics and things like that got tossed in that area because we found a trash deposit from like the 1850s. And I'll show you some of the objects we found there. What's interesting about that is that layer was associated with Warren Shepard. The ceramics in that layer were the ceramics he had on his table in the 1850s. And here's just a map showing all of our excavations. So getting oriented here. Here's the house. This was like the driveway, Riverside Court, so all our excavations. We didn't just dig in his land. We asked other people to dig on their land too. And so, quite a bit of coverage there. There's more that could be done, but we can only do so much in a couple of years, and I think we recovered lots of information. And some of these features, right? By features we mean like foundations and pits and things like that we really can't move. There were places where people modified the landscape. This is a lead water pipe. This is a foundation associated with that kitchen as well. It was interesting because these were almost immediately beneath the surface, and then there was like a lower course of stones here, as if that was like supporting it in some way. So, I don't know, these are just all river cobbles. As I recall, they were dry laid, or maybe they had a little bit of mortar, but we didn't really see much. But obviously, carefully placed there. And this is a little bit dark, but the discerning eye can see that this is a chamber pot. And this was a hole dug in the ground here, kind of dips down like this. And we think that was a privy. That was one of the outhouses. And quite interesting, one of the last things that was thrown in after they got running water was yeah, they didn't need it anymore. So into the pit it went, right? And so this is just chock full of artifacts from the early part of the 20th century.
It gets me that they threw all their junk into the privy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they had to close the hole up somehow, so. And then here's another. I think this is maybe part of that rabbit hutch, right? This little concrete foundation wall. So obviously later, right, this is probably, maybe 1850s associated with the house when it was constructed. This is something much later, we think. But nevertheless, I mean, that building hasn't been standing maybe, probably for 80 years and, 70 years or whatever. So and here's a pipe here, and I don't know if that held like a post in it or so. That was just behind there. Oh, I do have to tell you, since I mentioned that woman raising rabbits and I said that was the rabbit hutch, when we were working near that kitchen L, we were about this far down in one area, and we uncovered a little bit of, looked like clear plastic.
Oh.
Like, So we're carefully excavating it, because we carefully excavated everything, and we saw these little tiny bones, these little rib bones, and we're imagining, I mean, it's like like the size of a fetus, is what it was the size of, right? And we're looking, and so, I got my bioarchaeology colleague who studies human remains to come and look at it, studied it very closely, looked at it carefully, said, it's a bunny. So someone had wrapped up their little pet bunny, and it was a little bunny burial. So we were, that's, you never know what you're going to encounter, so. So some of the materials here. This is the match set. This is a paneled, 8-paneled, or this is like a 12-panel plate, and this is the cup, and there's saucers, and so he didn't have like a mismatched set. I mean, he had a matched set of this blue transfer printed ceramics, and these date to the middle of the 19th century, maybe even a little earlier. But there were other ceramics as well. These are hand painted. This is also transfer printed. And then this was an interesting piece because this has the logo of the sanitarium. So this is actually from the sanitarium.
Something swiped. That's great. That's great.
You said it, not me. Yeah.
In the pit too, I suppose, wasn't it?
Yeah. So that was rather interesting. So some of the other artifacts, various types of glass. I don't know if these are big milk of magnesia bottles or what they are exactly. Of course, these little pint or quart liquor bottles, not unusual. And then, items of recreation and adornment here, clay and glass marbles, a bead. This is a little bit of graphite, so a little writing implement. This is a straight razor for shaving. And then this is a button hook, right, for Emily Shepard to put on her shoes, yeah? And then various smoking pipe paraphernalia, right? These white clay pipes are just ubiquitous. You're found everywhere on historical archaeological sites. And they're a good temporal marker because they really don't show up after like World War I, for the most part, right? Because when our armed forces came back from France, they had learned from the French the cigarette, right? They were introduced to rolling papers. And so you can picture like women in the 1920s, right, with those long cigarette holders, and right, I mean, they're smoking cigarettes by then, right? But prior to that, there just wasn't, right? So these are good horizon markers and good chronological markers. These are interesting too, a wide array of buttons. So why so many buttons?
Shoes and clothes.
Clothes mostly.
No zippers.
You're right.
Maybe that piece too, and the other piece is we found some glass bottle containers that were like dark brown, like gallon-sized containers that held Clorox. So they're laundering, right? They're hand laundering. And so not unusual for buttons to come off in the course of hand laundering. And so that was one of the activities that was taking place in the backyard as well. So some of the domestic and household artifacts. These are coins. I think they're mostly Indian head pennies. This is a little inkwell. It's a little bell. I don't know if that was on one of the sheep, perhaps. Some of the cutlery. This is bone handled. And these materials were found in that 1850s deposit. So some of this cutlery, knives and spoons. This is probably a whetstone for sharpening knives. And then these are some of those bones that I made mention of before. Again, the same cutlery handle, some of those ceramics. So all of these objects, a bone button, so all of these objects were associated. In other words, they're in the same layer, they date to the same period. And all that material is probably from the 1850s and 1860s. So this was our crew outside the house. And we invited, let's see, I think it was St. Philip School to come out. They came out and they saw what we were doing, and we had other people visiting as well. And again, as I mentioned, some people showed up and they were like, hey, I lived here 40 years ago. Let me tell you my stories. And we're like, yes, we want to hear your stories. This is great. All right, so you got to help me with these. Yeah, so these are chipped stone arrowheads, right? It's probably hundreds and thousands of years old. What about this?
Yeah.
Cap gun? All right, I like that idea. So a few other objects. So let me tell you what we've concluded. So our archaeological investigations resulted in the recovery of thousands of artifacts. And they're all coming to you starting in about 20 minutes. Right? Our analysis has led to the publication of a report. So we've got a 150-page report that you can consult on an MA thesis, actually, and other publications.
Where are those located?
We can share those. We can share those with you. I know the report is already in the library, but we can make those available to you as well. And I think the Shepard site has much to teach us about 19th century life in Battle Creek, much that wasn't written down. As I mentioned, the artifact collections will soon be returned to Battle Creek, where they'll be available for display and further study. And once again, I want to thank the Battle Creek Historical Society for providing me with the opportunity to conduct this research and train so many WMU students in historical archaeology. Some have gone on to become very famous historical archaeologists and are making a valuable contribution to today's society. Thank you so much. If there are any questions, yes?
What do you know about the religion of Shepard and family?
He asked about the religion of Shepard. Nothing is jumping out at me.
I was wondering about the style of his beard.
Huh.
And,
What did it smear? Yeah, it's not jumping out at me as being Amish. I think it wouldn't be unusual to be bearded during that period, but I'd have to go back and check that report. I'm not recalling if he was devoutly. I think if he'd been devoutly religious, I think I would have remembered that. Yeah. Yes.
How deep did you dig to find those arrowheads?
Those were not, in most places in Michigan, if you dig down like this deep, you're down into soils that were laid down by the glaciers. So like before people even lived here. So most of what we call the archaeological record, in other words, the materials that people left behind, are like right there. Right. Now, sometimes there is that layering effect, and as you go deeper, it's older material. The way we could date those is by the style of them, right? So the way, so there you go. So if they're of early or middle woodland, right, they could still go back a couple thousand years, right? If they're late woodland and more recent, so. Other questions? Yes?
Was there more than one privy?
That's the only one that we encountered. It showed up in the geophysical work, and it's not to say that there weren't others there, but it showed up in the geophysical work, and we weren't quite sure what to make of it, but it was a pit that was quite deep, and we went down maybe about a meter, maybe about this deep, and so we didn't excavate it in its entirety. I mean, that's the other thing. Archaeologists don't usually dig everything completely up, right? We excavated enough, we photographed it, we made a drawing, we collected some of the artifacts, and then we just covered it back up. And so archaeologists in the future that are way smarter than me can go back and figure it out.
Was the log house that he lived in, where was that in relationship to the house?
Yeah, she was just asking about that log cabin. We think it was somewhere between where the house is today and the river back there. So we think it was further east, but we were unable to locate it. Yes?
Got a couple questions. Were you able to contact any of the relatives of Shepard family?
We were not.
Okay. And did you use any satellite images, like, to find the areas that people would have traveled?
Yeah, so we didn't use any satellite images to find where people had traveled. We focused really on that small area around the house, and the imagery that we did use was that magnetic survey.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? So, and obviously it's not going to tell us everything, but you have to keep in mind too that this guy brought in, like in 1985, he brought in heavy machinery, right? So that whole landscape has been disrupted to a good extent. It's not to say there couldn't be some undisturbed traces, but.
Have you seen that TV advertising where you put your phone up and you put this camera in front of it and you can see in the walls, look for electricity and the studs and things like that.
So you think to use something like that inside the house, you think, or?
You can use it anywhere, actually.
It looked like the outside walls, the plaster was right on the brick.
Yeah, in that one photo, yeah. I don't know, I know there's lath in some other places, but.
The interior walls might be hollow.
Yeah, lots more work to be done there, to be sure.
Any recommendations or?
For future work?
Yeah.
Well, I think the first step is actually to be able to just preserve the site, right? That's been the challenge all along.
Could it be moved? Put on a flatbed and just move it? Or not really? Is it structurally sound or is it?
I think Randy Case could probably answer that question, the architectural historian. I wouldn't hazard to guess it.
And the spring, is the spring still there?
We didn't go over and look for it, but I would imagine something like that will, I mean, it can get covered over, but I would imagine it would still be there.
Yeah, okay, great.
With that being so close to Territorial, which was an early road, you think that was a way house at one time because they forded the river there?
Well, I think the location was certainly advantageous to Shepard, right? For example, in moving his produce and the like, you know?
Probably where the bait house shop is.
So he was well situated, to be sure. And at one point, I think he became like the road commissioner. And we thought, oh, what kind of office is that? That's like dog catcher. And someone said, no. I mean, everything's being moved over roads. If you're the road commissioner and you got to fix that road or this road, then you can have an influence on that. Yeah, so he may have ensured that the routes that he was moving his goods, I mean, I'm just saying, right? I mean, there may have been some advantages to that position to being able to help himself out, perhaps. Yes?
You made a comment about I thought you said one of the daughters commented or was in a written record somewhere that when that Italian family bought the house, they ruined the house.
Yeah, that was the neighbor.
The neighbor said that.
Yeah.
When about was that house sold to that family, the Italian family?
To the Miachis was about the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s.
I wonder, the reason I ask is many people may know that when many folks from Europe first came here, particularly the Italians, they weren't considered white. And I wonder if because of that, the neighbor then said, well, the house is ruined because in her perception, it wasn't the same racial group that moved in there. I just found that very interesting, that was coming.
And they're running a speakeasy, and they're carousing, and I mean, what are these people doing? I mean,
Having a party and enjoying life.
yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.